The first thing Caleb noticed was that nobody was looking at him. The second was that his 8-year-old daughter, Nora, was trying very hard not to notice either. She sat beside him at the wedding reception in a pale yellow dress, swinging her little shoes beneath the table while Caleb stared at the empty chair across from them. Around them, champagne glasses sparkled, music floated through the grand ballroom, and wealthy families laughed beneath enormous floral arrangements. Caleb had been invited because the bride was his late wife's cousin, but somewhere between the ceremony and the reception, he had realized the truth. Everyone here had someone. He had Nora. And tonight, he was painfully aware that she was all he had left. If you believe kindness, hope, forgiveness, compassion, and second chances can change a life, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us that good hearts still matter. Caleb had once believed his life was ordinary and secure. He had worked as a building inspector outside Seattle, Washington, and his wife, Rachel, had been a school librarian who could make even the hardest day feel manageable. Then, 2 years earlier, an illness had taken Rachel away, leaving Caleb with a daughter who still sometimes asked questions about heaven before bedtime. Since then, Caleb had learned how expensive grief could be. He sold their second car, moved into a smaller house, took every extra assignment he could find, and quietly stopped buying things for himself. Nora always came first. New shoes for her meant another week of sandwiches for him. A school field trip for her meant postponing repairs to the kitchen sink. He never complained. He simply kept moving because a little girl was watching him, and he wanted her to believe that tomorrow could still be good. That evening, Nora had asked why everyone seemed so happy while Daddy looked sad. Caleb smiled and told her he was simply tired. What he did not tell her was that he had overheard 2 guests earlier, wondering why a man like him had even been invited. He had arrived in a modest navy suit with a carefully repaired tie, while the room glittered with designer dresses and expensive watches. He felt like a wrong note in a beautiful song. Then, just as the newly married couple began their first dance, something unexpected happened. An older woman in an elegant deep purple gown rose from a nearby table. She was in her early 70s, silver-haired, poised, and unmistakably wealthy. People seemed to recognize her immediately. Conversations quieted as she walked across the ballroom, passing table after table until she stopped directly beside Caleb. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, a self-made billionaire who had built a national chain of senior living communities and charitable foundations. Caleb had heard her name before, but he never imagined she would know his. She looked first at Nora, then at Caleb, and instead of asking why he was sitting alone, she simply pulled out the empty chair and sat with them. Caleb was nervous, but Margaret made no attempt to impress him. She asked Nora about school, listened carefully when the little girl described her favorite science project, and then asked Caleb what he did for work. When he answered, honestly, she smiled and said that people often confused a person's income with a person's worth. Caleb looked at her, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. Then, Margaret told him why she had come over. She had watched him during the ceremony. While everyone else had been taking pictures, Caleb had been fixing Nora's hair ribbon. When the little girl became nervous walking into the crowded reception, he had quietly held her hand. When dessert arrived, he gave Nora the better piece without hesitation. Margaret had noticed every small thing. She said she had spent decades surrounded by people who wanted something from her, but she had just watched a father give everything he had without expecting anything in return. Caleb thought the conversation would end there. Instead, Margaret asked if he would meet her the following week. She was looking for someone to oversee a new community project. Her foundation was planning in Washington, a family resource center designed to help working parents find affordable childcare, educational support, and career assistance. She did not offer him charity. She offered him a chance. Caleb almost refused because pride told him he had to solve everything alone. But Nora squeezed his hand beneath the table and whispered that Mommy would want him to say yes. Weeks later, Caleb began working with Margaret's foundation. His practical experience, honesty, and understanding of struggling families made him exactly the person Margaret had been searching for. But the greatest surprise came months later when the new center opened. Margaret asked Caleb to speak at the ceremony. Standing before hundreds of people, he looked at Nora sitting in the front row and remembered that lonely wedding table. He realized that Margaret had not rescued him. She had simply seen something in him that grief had taught him to overlook. Margaret later admitted that she had been lonely too. Wealth had given her almost everything, except the one thing money could never purchase. People who stayed because they cared. Caleb became more than an employee. He became a trusted friend, and Nora became the granddaughter. Like presents Margaret had never expected to have. There were no fairy tale promises, and no overnight transformation. There were simply dinners, school plays, Sunday walks, difficult conversations, and two families slowly learning that love could arrive in unexpected forms. Before the ending, I want to ask you something from the heart. If this story reminded you of someone who deserves a second chance, leave a comment telling us what kindness has meant in your life. Your words might encourage someone who is quietly struggling today. And if Caleb and Nora's story touched your heart, please share this video, leave a like, and stay connected with us for more stories about hope, family, and the unexpected people who change our lives. Years later, Caleb returned to that same ballroom with Nora, now a confident teenager, for another family celebration. He looked across the room and saw Margaret standing near the window, smiling at them. He remembered the lonely man he had been that night and realized how different everything felt now. The empty chair beside him had once represented everything he had lost. Now, it represented something else entirely. It reminded him that when one chapter closes, life does not always replace what was lost in the way we expect. Sometimes it sends someone across a crowded room simply to sit beside you and remind you that you are still worthy of being seen.